Welcome to the HFS Hope Focus System and Autism Talk Series, Part 1, presented by CogLeap. In Part 1, we're going to be talking about autism spectrum disorder and diverse brain functioning. Let's take a look at the common interventions for children with autism. The most popular one is ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis. This includes structured goal-directed therapy with positive reinforcement to improve behavior. We also see speech therapy that helps with communication and language difficulties to improve verbal and nonverbal communication skills. We also sometimes see occupational therapy. This actually helps with addressing sensory and motor skills, as well as improving daily living skills and increasing independence for children with autism. We also see social skills training in common interventions, teaching appropriate social behavior, as well as enhancing social interaction and communication. And lastly, sensory integration therapy is also commonly seen. It addresses sensory processing issues and helps to regulate and manage sensory sensitivities. There are common interventions that cover a wide range of functions and difficulties, but these also pose challenges and disadvantages in and of themselves. Let's take a look at what they are. The first and most important one is the cost and accessibility. Dividing all of the interventions into separate small ones is extremely time consuming and costly. We can't imagine that each family has to go to several different locations every day of the week to get a little bit of each of these different interventions, all of which actually do help with autism. The second challenge or disadvantage is that sometimes these interventions are one size fits all. So the intervention may not take into account each child's uniqueness, and sometimes they're not personalized. Third, we see some limited generalization. So this means that the intervention cannot be generalized into other life settings outside of the intervention. Also, that the intervention may not be comprehensive, it's not holistic, and it may only target certain issues. A fourth disadvantage is the lack of deep parental involvement. So now we know that parents or guardians of children with autism are really the ones that we need to be talking to and really know the profile of their children the best. But when an intervention lacks deep parental involvement, the onus really falls entirely on the child. This creates a lot more pressure on the child, in fact. The fifth challenge that we talk about here is stigma and social acceptance. So some interventions, they may not consider the impact of discrimination against children in society and how it may result in some emotional difficulties and trauma and unable to address that. And lastly, we talk about the lack of long-term results. So interventions may work for a short period of time or shortly after the intervention, but they may not have a lasting effect. When we talk about neurodiversity in autism spectrum disorder, we're really talking about how the brains of children with autism are unique. Neurodiversity means differences, diversity in brain functioning and brain structure. And that is how we recognize children with autism. So let's take a look at how children with autism have unique brains and how they are different. The first domain of functioning we look at is body and movement control. In ASD children, we see that they have atypical development of the cerebellum. Cerebellum is a really important part of the brain back here that coordinates movement and controls posture, balance, and fine motor movement. And so because of this atypical development, it causes difficulties in coordination and planning. And also a subcortical area of the brain called the basal ganglia also sees atypical development. Another way that the brains of ASD children are different in terms of body and movement control is their ability to integrate sensory information with their motor movements. This affects their body self-awareness and their balance and coordination. And the third area where their brains are different in this respect has to do with mirror neurons. Children with ASD, we see mirror neuron dysfunction, and it affects the way that they can imitate and learn through observation. And so, in fact, children with ASD, a lot of the times, may not necessarily learn the best through seeing or observing. In fact, they learn sometimes much better through doing or moving. The second area where children with ASD show diversity in their brain function is sensory processing. We're really talking about our senses, sense of smell, our sight, our hearing, our taste, our touch, and the way that children with ASD process sensory input is very different from typical development. We see that sometimes there's overreaction to certain stimuli, so that's hypersensitivity, or there's sometimes a decreased activity or lack of response to other stimuli, so that's hyposensitivity. It could go either way. And there's also something called atypical sensory gating. So this means that children with ASD sometimes have difficulty filtering out irrelevant sensory information, and so they get really bombarded by all sorts of sensory input. A third area where ASD children show diversity in brain function is in communication and language. So we see atypical brain connections in neural pathways for language processing, as well as for auditory processing. And so the parts of the brain that are involved with language, speech production, speech comprehension, reading, understanding, and auditory processing, hearing sounds, and understanding speech and distinguishing that from background noise. We see differences in all of these interconnected areas. So you can see here that the auditory processing areas are actually very connected to language processing areas. When we observe different language and speech and communication behaviors in ASD, we can also know from our understanding of brain connection and function that there is an underlying difficulty also that comes from processing auditory stimuli, sound stimuli. And so here we see in green is the motor cortex, and in purple is the sensory motor cortex, and in the blue purple, we see the primary auditory cortex, and green is the visual cortex, and also this is the prefrontal cortex. And when we just look at this outer part of the brain, we call the cerebral cortex, we see that actually in these colored areas, that the brains of children with ASD are different from typical development in quite many areas. Lastly, I want to mention that in children with ASD, another important area where they show diverse brain function is in emotional regulation. So many of us may have heard of the amygdala. The amygdala is this little blue area in the brain, deep inside the brain, that helps us process emotion, especially negative emotion and fear. And in children with ASD, they have difficulty correctly assessing the emotional significance of stimuli. So, what this means is that they have difficulty gauging how intense or not intense actually something is in terms of how emotional they are. And we see the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala here. So the amygdala kind of acts as the gas pedal, and the prefrontal cortex kind of acts as the brake pedal. And these have to work in unison. In typical development, we see that the prefrontal cortex balances out the gas pedal. So we can slow down, take rational pauses, use our thinking and understanding to help us regulate our emotions, especially when it comes to fear and very intense negative emotions. What we find is that in children with autism, this connection between the gas pedal and the brake pedals are dysregulated. And so children with autism have a difficult time trying to balance and regulate their emotions, also particularly due to this network here. So let's revisit the concept of neurodiversity. When we talk about autism spectrum disorder, we know that in the DSM, it is listed under neurodevelopmental disorder in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which we use as a diagnostic criteria for ASD. And in 2013, the new DSM-5 lists ASD as an autism spectrum disorder. So it no longer has differences with Asperger's or sensory processing disorder. Everything falls under spectrum. And this gives us a clue that there is a very, very wide range of behavioral presentations that we see in children with autism. And this also comes from a large heterogeneity in terms of the genetic factors and also the cortical, the brain factors that give rise to the behavioral differences and symptoms that we observe. So after taking a look at the ways in which children with autism have differences in brain functioning compared to typical development, we can ask the question, does being neurodivergent or does having different brain development necessarily mean that it's a disorder? Or is it just that children with ASD are neurodivergent? They are just different in their brain structure, function, and connectivities. Another good way to look at autism, instead of using the disordered lens or the medical model, but treating them as disorder or a patient, is to consider, well, what factors cause difficulties in life when we have a brain such as the ones found in children with autism? What are some environmental factors and society factors that may cause difficulty in day to day life? Now, remember, our environment and our society is structured and built to serve neurotypical children and adults. And living in a neurotypically built environment can be very, very difficult for neurodiverse children. And so I hope that this perspective brings a little bit more empathy and understanding to looking at ASD through a neurodiversity lens.